This program has been brought to you thanks to the generous contributions of our patrons on Patreon. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. And for more content like this, be sure to check out the Modern Alchemist channel on Patreon.
Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
In ancient Egypt dwelt the great adepts and masters who have never been surpassed, and who have seldom been equaled, during the centuries that have taken their processional flight since the days of great Hermes. In Egypt was located the great lodge of lodges of the mystics. At the doors of her temples entered the neophytes who afterwards, as hierophants, adepts, and masters, traveled to the four corners of the earth, carrying with them the precious knowledge which they were ready, anxious, and willing to pass on to those who were ready to receive the same. All students of the occult recognize the debt that they owe to these venerable masters of that ancient land. But among these great masters of ancient Egypt, there once dwelt one of whom the masters hailed as the Master of Masters. This man, if man indeed he was, dwelt in Egypt in the earliest days. He was known as Hermes Trismegistus. He was the father of occult wisdom, the founder of astrology, the discoverer of alchemy. The details of his life story are lost to history, owing to the lapse of years, though several of the ancient countries disputed with each other in their claims to the honor of having furnished his birthplace. And this thousands of years ago. The date of his sojourn in Egypt, in that his last incarnation on the planet, is not now known, but it has been fixed at the early days of the oldest dynasties of Egypt, long before the days of Moses. The best authorities regard him as a contemporary of Abraham, and some of the Jewish tradition go so far as to claim that Abraham acquired a portion of his mystic knowledge from Hermes himself. So in these two paragraphs, I think that it's really important to maintain a degree of mental alacrity, specifically with regard to the nature and physical character of Hermes Trismegistus. There is so much mythology tied to all of these characters, whether it's Hermes, whether it's Abraham, whether it is Moses. And from my standpoint as an astrotheologian and symbologist, when I look at these characters, I'm seeing them represented on more than one level or aspect. I'm seeing their narrative and their composition be representative of celestial forces which are observed, we being the observer, the third party looking on and observing these interactions take place on such an extraordinary scale, and then that scale, through the principle of correspondence, then is drawn down to human terms. And I also see that it is possible that contemporaries, mortal beings, people, sandal-wearing guys back in the day could have been seen as an analog to these greater powers, meaning that by extension, they get credit for something which is larger than themselves. There are so many different ways to look at this, but I often caution my students to avoid literalism, to take it on its face. And so when you see that statements like this man, if man indeed he was, dwelt in Egypt in the earliest days, when you see things like that, don't get all bound up by it. we want to keep this something that can be utilized in terms that we understand. And most of us on Earth have very little interaction with beings of greater consciousness. Most of us have very little interaction with, extraordinary intelligences that are not kindred to us as human beings, right? So I try to keep it on those terms, and to not let it blow up out of proportion. As the years rolled by after his passing from this plane of life, tradition recording that he lived 300 years in the flesh, the Egyptians deified Hermes and made him one of their gods, under the name Thoth. Years after, the people of ancient Greece also made of him one of their many gods, calling him Hermes, the god of wisdom. The Egyptians revered his memory for many centuries, yes, tens of centuries, calling him the scribe of the gods, and bestowing upon him distinctively his ancient title Trismegistus, which means thrice great, the great, the greatest great, etc. In all the ancient lands, the name of Hermes Trismegistus was revered, the name being synonymous with the fount of wisdom. All right, let's talk about the process of Egyptian deification. This is something that the Egyptians did on more than one occasion. In fact, Imhotep, who is the lead antagonist in the Mummy movies with Brendan Fraser, Imhotep is actually drawn from ancient Egyptian history. Imhotep himself could be seen as a type of Hermes Trismegistus, meaning that Imhotep introduced significant portions of medicine, philosophy, and science to the Egyptian people. And by significant, I mean that he was unsurpassed for an extraordinary period of time. And it is for this reason, then, that later on he was deified among the Egyptian people. So the idea of taking a person who was apparently mortal but long-lived and deifying him after his death is not unheard of. And in fact, it was a component of esoteric tradition. We today still do this process, and you can go and visit the Washington Memorial in Washington, D.C., and if you look up onto the ceiling, you will see the apotheosis of George Washington, which is a fancy way of saying that he's been deified. So the idea then of the deification of a mortal who has contributed significantly to a people of a particular generation is not only not unheard of, but is in fact still practiced in the modern age. Even to this day, we use the term Hermetic in the sense of secret, sealed so that nothing can escape, etc. And this by reason of the fact that the followers of Hermes always observed the principle of secrecy in their teachings. They did not believe in casting pearls before swine, but rather held to the teaching, milk for babes, meat for strong men, both of which maxims are familiar to readers of the Christian scriptures, but both of which have been used by the Egyptians for centuries before the Christian era. All right, let's talk about this term Hermetic. My first encounter with this term was as a child watching Johnny Carson with my parents. And Johnny Carson would do this shtick. He was a late night host. He would do this shtick where he would wear this funny hat, and his assistant would hand him a mason jar that they would announce had been hermetically sealed, and so he was unable to know what the actual question was, and then he'd provide an answer to the question that would be funny. It was a brilliant shtick, but that's how I first learned of what Hermetic meant, which meant to seal and prevent someone to have access to. And in fact, that is exactly what the Hermetic teaching tradition does. Now, it's important to recognize this for a number of reasons. It's important to recognize this because that means, again, that whatever you think you might know or understand about the Hermetic teachings and the Hermetic tradition may very well be in error, because this material, when it is taught in full, is rarely taught openly to people in the world. It is kept secret largely because of a history wherein these teachings were abused by the people who chose to not receive them. And, the idea of casting pearls before swine, it may appear to be judgmental. And certainly it's an extraordinary indictment to those who reject this material. But I think that this indictment is the process of long and hard roads of experience. When I first encountered this myself, I thought it was mean. I thought it just was mean to say that about a person because they lacked the judgment or perception to comprehend what it was that was in front of them. And for most of that, I don't hold the person on the other end responsible, because so much of their consciousness has been plied by their environment to the degree that they may not be able to receive this information. In other sense, the idea of milk for babes and meat for strong men, this idea is reflected really more or less in the aptitude of the student. Just like a child or an infant, the student will inform you that they are unable to consume what you are presenting to them. And this is why, to forestall that problem, there are all these axioms and maxims presented within the Kybalion, which at first may not be understood, but then as a course of one's experience and as a course of one's encounter with the Hermetic tradition, these maxims and axioms then become clear. They become clear on their own. And the student of the Hermetic tradition gains a degree of comprehension.